Today we're going to continue in our series, A Walk Through the Bible. And we're coming to the end of Genesis and the continuation of the life of Jacob. So if you're wondering where we are in our magnificent timeline that some have said never take down, we're between the two windows over there of Joseph, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph. So I said this is the continuation of the life of Jacob. So we're going to be in the final 13 chapters of Genesis. So if you have a Bible, I'm going to give you a couple minutes in advance. Get a Bible. If you need a Bible, raise your hand. We will give you one. It's important that you follow through in a Bible this morning because we're going to be moving through 12 of those 13 chapters. We're going to be moving quickly, so buckle up and hold on. It's going to be a fun ride. And I guarantee when you get to the end, it's all going to make sense. Just like our lives, right? When we're going through things, we can't see it in the middle, but when we get to the end, we can look back and we can see how and what God did through it. So let's recap Jacob's journey. Pastor Mike talked about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob 2 weeks ago. We talked a little bit about Jacob. And if you remember, Jacob stole his birthright, got his father's blessing, and Esau was going to kill him, so he ran away. He was sent away because his parents didn't want him to marry a Canaanite woman. So they sent him to his mother, Rebekah's brother's home. Laban was his name. And on his way, he stopped at a watering hole where shepherds were watering sheep, and he met his wife, who would be Rachel. He fell in love with Rachel. Love at first sight. So then he went on to meet Laban, and he said, "Can I come here and work for you?" And Laban said, "Sure, but I can't charge. You're a member of my family." He was related. He was Rebekah's brother. His mother's brother. I think I said that, sorry. And so he said, "I don't want you to work for me. How can I repay you?" He said, "I would like to have Rachel's hand in marriage." He said, "All right, work for me for 7 years, and then I will give you Rachel." Now remember, Pastor Mike talked about Jacob. He wasn't the greatest of human beings, and he was known as a deceiver. He was a liar. He didn't do things the way they should be done, but God continued, because he was part of the lineage that God was setting up, continued to bless him. We're going to find that Jacob's going to be deceived multiple times today in our story. So he's going to get a little bit back of what he gave. So when it came time for the 7 years to be up, he went to marry Rachel, and Laban instead gave him his daughter Leah. And he was outraged. They said, "You promised me Rachel." And he said, "Well, in our custom, we don't normally give away the younger daughter before the older daughter. Leah's my oldest daughter." So he married her. "Work for me 7 more years, and then I'll give you Rachel." So he did it. And eventually he married Rachel. And during this time, Leah was able to have many children. And eventually when she stopped childbearing, she and Rachel, because she couldn't have children and she was struggling, they both gave their maidservants to Jacob. So he's having sons, and he had 10 altogether through the maidservants and Leah. Eventually then, God blessed Rachel, and she was able to have Joseph. And at this time, Jacob is older in his life, and he loves Rachel, so he really favors Joseph. And eventually, she will also have another child, the 12th child, and that is Benjamin, and she will pass during childbirth. She will die during childbirth. And so he has these 2 sons from Rachel. Now, you will remember that we have just heard about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob 2 weeks ago. As I said, he was the deceiver, liar, and ultimately he wrestled with God, and then he was renamed Israel. So when you think of Jacob, you want to think the word Israel. And when we talk about the 12 tribes of Israel, they're going to come from the 12 sons of Jacob. 12 tribes are the 12 sons. So why is this important? Because it sets up where we are today in our story. So please turn to Genesis 37, if you're not already there. And we're going to look at verses 1 through 3. So Jacob settled again in the land of Canaan, where his father had lived as a foreigner. And this is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. So first of all, the 2 ladies mentioned there are the maidservants I referenced earlier. And so he had all these half-brothers. And so now he's favored by his father, and all these other brothers can see that. So with Jacob, God begins to speak through dreams, and dreams will be the central theme throughout the passages today. So as you may remember, God has spoken to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, Adam, Eve, Cain, Noah, not Jacob, sorry. He spoke to them directly. He walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. He spoke to each of them, he came to them, but now he's going to start speaking through dreams. And dreams are going to be a very integral part of our story today. They're going to come up 3 different times, and they're going to influence what happens all during the story. So when God speaks in dreams is where we're going to start, and we're starting in Joseph sold into slavery in Genesis 37, when God speaks in dreams. So let's start now with, we're going to read verse 3. Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word about him. So we're going to use some other things, some illustration pieces today to talk about the transition that Joseph would go through. So we don't know exactly what the robe was that his father gave him, but it was they call it a coat of many colors. It was something that stood out, and it's something that the brothers had to look at constantly that reminded them that Jacob loved Joseph more. It's a constant reminder of it, and it's going to play an integral part in our story. So we're going to start out with the coat of many colors, and this is what Joseph is wearing when one day he has a dream. And in verse 5 it says, one night Joseph had a dream, and when he told his brothers about it, they hated him more than ever. Listen to this dream, he said. We were out in the field tying up bundles of grain, and suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles all gathered around and bowed low before mine. Uh-oh. His brothers responded, do you think you will be a king, our king? Do you actually think you will reign over us? And they hated him all the more because of his dreams and the way he talked about them. You know, knowing the will of God doesn't always make you popular. Knowing the will of God doesn't always make you popular. God showed him in a vision what he was going to do. Now, I don't know what the motivation was with Joseph. I'm not sure that he should have taken this to his brothers. Maybe he was just said, hey guys, I had this dream. What do you think about it? It could have been he's 17. It could have just been, what do you got? Or he could have known. Or maybe he had a little bit of pride because he's starting to believe his father's words that he's favored and he's his favorite. So maybe that's why I did it. I was going to put in my notes, there's no one to hold him, no one to fold him, and no when to walk away. I don't know that he should have come back to them again, but he does. In verse 9, he says, soon Joseph had another dream. And he told the dream to his father as well. He told his brother, but listen, I had another dream. He said, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed low before me. And this time he told the dream to his father as well as to his brothers. But his father scolded him. What kind of dream is that? He asked, will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow low to the ground before you? But while his brothers were jealous of Joseph, his father wondered what the dreams meant. You know, when we look at this, pride leads to disgrace, but humility comes wisdom, Proverbs 11:2. We don't know the reason behind why Joseph felt that he had needed to tell the dream to his brothers once. But now he says, repeating a matter makes it twice as strong. Repeating a matter makes it twice as strong. This alienated Joseph, which led to the plans for his murder. You know, love prospers when a fault is forgiven, but dwelling on it separates close friends. This was the last straw for his brothers. Now he's not only favored, but now he's saying that they're going to bow down to him, and they're not going to have that. Love prospers when a fault is forgiven, but dwelling on it separates close friends. That was Proverbs 17:9. So this alienation led to the plans for murder. So I'll tell you what happens next. One day, Jacob says to Joseph, go out. I want to send you out to where your brothers are out tending the sheep, and I'd like you to check up on them. So here we are again. I don't know if he's the tattletale, if he's spying on them in some ways. I don't know what the true motivation for all of this is. But his father sends him out to check on his brothers. He goes and he looks for them. They're not where they originally should be. He's directed to another area. And as he's coming to his brothers from afar off, the brothers see him in his multicolored coat. And they say, here comes the dreamer. Let's kill him. We'll just tell Dad that he got killed by a wild animal. Reuben, one of his brothers, then said in verse 21, but when Reuben heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. Let's not kill him, he said. Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into this empty cistern here in the wilderness, and then he'll die without our laying a hand on him. Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. A cistern is like a bulbous, something a chemist would use and then a thin neck. And so this was made in the ground, and so it would have a thin, long neck and then a bulbous bottom, and cisterns hold water. This one happened to be empty. They tore his robe off of him, and they threw him down in the cistern, and they were so without any guilt that they went and ate lunch right after they had thrown him in there to die. Well, as they're eating their lunch, a caravan's coming across the horizon, and it's some Ishmaelites, Midian traders, and one of them says, Judah says to his brothers in verse 26, what will we gain by killing our brother? We'd have to cover up the crime. Instead of hurting him, let's sell him to those Ishmaelite traders. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. So when the Ishmaelites, who were Midianite traders, came by, Joseph's brothers pulled him out of the cistern and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver, and the traders took him to Egypt. B says God's protection comes in many forms. God's protection comes in many forms. You know, sometimes it takes the form of a brother. That brother can be a relative. It can be a friend. It can be someone that while you're in the midst of suffering and pain and what you're going through, they come alongside you. Maybe you know someone like that. Maybe you've been in a difficult situation and God sent someone to rescue you. So Judah rescued him out of the pit. And then Judah saved his life because he was going to die in that pit if Reuben didn't get back and pull him out. And the brothers probably would have just found another opportunity, excuse me, another opportunity to kill him if he didn't die in there because they just couldn't stand him. So God had an ultimate purpose here. And God's plans and protection comes in many forms, and sometimes it comes in the form of a brother. And that would be Reuben. Don't look out for only your own interests, but take an interest in others too, as Philippians 2:4. Reuben cared for Joseph. What part can you play in helping someone who's going through, I said, who helped you in your suffering? Who can you help who's going through suffering like he did? You know what? God's protection is always at the right time. And that's what we just read about the Midianites. He brought them just at that moment. When the brothers had already thrown him in there to die, God provided these people to come and take him. Now, he wasn't taking him home to his father, back to his favored position. They were taking him into Egypt to be sold as a slave. God found a way when there was no way. We just sang that. God found a way when there was no way. 2 Thessalonians 3:3 says, but the Lord is faithful. He will strengthen you and guard you from the evil one. So the brothers have to go back to their father and tell them, as Joseph's being taken off by the Midianite traders, we found this tunic and it has blood all over it. He must have been killed by a wild animal. They had killed a goat and smeared the blood all over his coat of many colors. to prove to his father, and Jacob was devastated, absolutely devastated that he lost his beloved son Joseph. But now Joseph's heading into Egypt. And I encourage you to read chapters 37 to 50 on your own. It's an exciting read. There's way too much for me to go through in detail, and there's a lot of details I'm leaving out. And it really adds seasoning to the story. It really does. But we're talking about some major events as we move through, and those major events just in themselves are enough. But if you read all the details in there, please take some time. It won't be a long read. It'll be an exciting read. I promise you. So Joseph has to trade his coat of many colors, brilliant, nice colors, to what a slave would wear. We don't know what a slave would wear, but this is what we're going to have as a slave clothes. So as you notice, as he goes to these different things, he's going to have to change his clothes each time. So he's going from the favored coat, then it was bloodstained to deceive his father that he was dead and been killed, and now he's going to wear the clothes of a slave. The Midianites take him into Egypt and they sell him to Potiphar. Potiphar's the captain of the guard. And he takes him into his home. So now we are down in number 2. Joseph is in the house of Potiphar. Turn ahead, if you will, to chapter 39. We're going to skip over 38. Again, when you look on this timeline, you will see that Jesus did not come through Joseph. He came through Judah. And the story in chapter 38 is about Judah and Tamar. And eventually through that lineage is where Jesus comes. That's the red line that's running. So when you look at Joseph, it gives his birth and his death. But the red line, you'll notice Judah and Tamar. So go back and read 38 at some point. We're going to move on. He's in the house of Potiphar. And God will always provide for our best. Let's look in verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, so he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. And so Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what food to eat. God will always provide for our best. We sang, He promised to never leave my side. He'll never leave our side. That's what we sang. And that's what he was doing with Joseph here. He was not leaving his side. God had a bigger picture planned for Joseph. But he had to prepare Joseph for what his ultimate plan was. Joseph isn't ready. He's 17 years old, but he still has some gifts and some abilities that God's going to ultimately use for a greater purpose. So Potiphar could put him in charge of everything in his life. And it says here, just like we can with God, it says, so don't worry about these things, saying, what will you eat and what will you drink, what will you wear? These things dominate the thoughts of unbelievers, but your heavenly Father already knows all your needs. When we are in the will of God, he will provide all our needs and prepare us for what's next. So here we find he was a favored son. He was put in a pit to die. He's sold as a slave, and now he's in the slave home, but God's blessing him. He's prospering. And then it came about that Potiphar's wife found him attractive. And she kept asking him to have an affair with her. And he kept refusing, and kept refusing, and kept refusing. He said to her in verse 8 of chapter 39, but Joseph refused. He said, look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back everything from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. God will bless those who resist temptation. God will bless those who resist temptation. God blesses those who patiently endure testing and temptation. Afterward, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. If you're following God and you're walking along according to his purpose and you're looking for all things to be turned to good, then part of that is withstanding the temptations that we all face every single day, those things that are against God and against what he wants us to do. And so as the story goes on, she kept coming after him and tempting him, and he kept refusing. And one day, when they were alone in the house and none of the other workmen were there, she again tried to seduce him, and she grabbed his coat, and he pulled away and out of it, and he ran out of the house. He refused to sin against God. Well, now she's holding his coat, and so she knows what this looks like and what she can do. So she screams out to the other men that Joseph had just tried to assault her. And so the men all run in, and when Potiphar gets back, this is what is said. Potiphar was furious. This we're in verse 19. Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. Joseph hadn't done a thing. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. God continually blesses all that Joseph does. This is the first time we read of a patriarch in the Bible being upright, truthful, and faithful to God. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all lied and conceived and did things that were wrong outside of God's will on their own because they wanted to make things happen. Abraham and Jacob both lied that their wives, they really were their sisters or related to them, but they lied so that they wouldn't be hurt. That wasn't God's will. God would have provided for them in another way. But here we find Joseph is pure in spirit and wants to follow God and wants to be faithful to him. So on the surface, it seems as though God is not with him because one thing after another seems to go wrong. We must remember that when we walk faithfully, God will intercede for our good, even though our circumstances seem hopeless. So Joseph now has left his slave garb, and now he is wearing a prison outfit, a rag that he wears there in the prison. So he's traded his multicolored favored jacket and his slave clothes where he was prospering, and now he is in prison for something he had not done. He was innocent. He was being unfairly treated. But God had a bigger plan in mind. At all times, remember, I talked about him having to be prepared for the ultimate job God had planned for him. If you're going through suffering and trials, what does God have at the end of that he wants to use you for? What is he preparing you for during the process of your pain, your suffering, your trial? That's what we have to look for. That's Joseph had to have. I wonder what Joseph was saying when all this was happening to him. He had to wonder the lyrics of the song we sang. If there is a God who holds the whole world in his hand, then where were you when mine came crashing down? If there's a God who tells the sun and the stars where to shine, then where were you when all the lights went out? But he finishes in that song, although I can't see you, I'm choosing to believe. That's what Joseph did. He chose to believe. He didn't question God. He didn't get angry with God. I can't imagine that. But he did have that dream, that when there are two dreams, it becomes so. And so the first two sets of dreams, now we're going to start with what happens to him in prison. But let's not get too far past that, because as Joseph is in prison, we're going to read verses 21 to 23. Right. But the Lord was with Joseph in prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. Faithful obedience leads to complete blessing. Again, God was with Joseph and blessed all that he did. as God continued to use and again prepare him, what we're going to find out was to save that known world. So he had to have gifts already of leadership and organization, and he used those within Potiphar's home. Now he's moving up to a large organization where he's going to run the prison. We look at Deuteronomy 28, 1-2 and verse 6. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully keep all his commandments that I am giving you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the world. You will experience all these blessings if you obey the Lord your God. Wherever you go and whatever you do, you will be blessed. This was written to the children of Israel, and if you follow God, if you obey me, I will be with you in everything that you do. You could say to me, Pastor Chris, I get this. Great story. Great story. I believe it happened. I don't know how it relates to my life. I don't know how it relates to the things I'm going through, how I'm suffering, the pain I'm going through, the illness I'm having, the stage 4 cancer, the death of my loved one, you name it. How does that apply to this? It applies in this way. When we trust in Jesus Christ and we follow him and we obey him and we try to the best of our ability in our broken world and our broken bodies that are not, even though we're saved, are not sinless. But as much as we try to be more like Christ and follow him, these things are promised to us, that he will use them for good. We don't know how they will be. We don't know the outcome. But maybe the thing you're going through, you can ultimately help someone else go through. I know there are people in this room who have been through terrible situations, and now they're blessing others. They're able to go and sit beside people going through the same thing. And that's some of the reason God allowed that, but it's also the good he's making out of the pain that they were through. So Joseph is in prison, and 2 men that are in there are thrown in there. They're in Pharaoh's court. The cupbearer and the baker. I believe that they were in there because Pharaoh thought they had tried to kill him, and they were doing an investigation. He didn't know if whatever sickness he had came from what he drank or what he ate. But he threw them both into prison, and they're in there. And one night, here we are with our second set of dreams. Both men have a dream in the evening. The first cupbearer has a dream. I'm not going to read you the dream, but I'm going to tell you what Joseph's interpretation was. So both the cupbearer and the baker, they look sad in the morning. Joseph comes into the prison and says, "What's wrong with you?" We can see their countenances down. Well, we both had dreams, but we don't know what the interpretation is. He said, "Well, tell me the dream." And they each tell him their dream. And this is the interpretation to the cupbearer. "This is what the dream means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches represent 3 days, and within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as the chief cupbearer." And now this is important. "And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh, so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it." Well, when the baker sees that he got a favorable review of his dream, he says, "Can you do mine also?" So he does, and his is not as favorable. And we'll hear what actually happened. So it was Pharaoh's birthday. It came 3 days later, as he said. And he prepared a banquet for all his officials and staff, and he summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position, so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But Pharaoh impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted his dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. So here we are. He was the favored son. He was thrown in to die. He's now been taken into slavery. Now he's in jail, and he does something good, and again he's not remembered. That has to be hopeless. That has to be, I don't know what you have in mind, but he still had that dream in the beginning, that his family was going to be bowing down to him. How much did that hold in his mind at this point? I don't know. He's not even with his family anymore. So how's that even an issue? But he trusted God. He knew God was always going to be with him. Joseph held up against temptation, and God is with everything he does. God's intervention prepares us for whatever we may face. He confronts us in our troubles so that we can, he comforts us in our troubles so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. That's 2 Corinthians 1:4. God gave Joseph the ability to interpret dreams, and he was kind to the men and was able to use this gift to help others. God is still working, even though all seems hopeless. It will not be for 2 more years until this kindness is paid back. Yet God has continued to be a blessing to Joseph and prepare him for what comes next. He ran Potiphar's household, he's run the prison, and now let's see what God has next. Now there's another set of 2 dreams, and we're in chapter 41 if you're following along. 2 full years later. 2 full years later. Remember, he was 17. At this point, he is 28. All this has happened between the slavery and the prison. We don't know how long he was in each, but he was there 11 years now so far. Now 2 more years he's now 30 years old. 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. And in his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and began grazing in the marsh grass. And then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood before the fat cows on the riverbank, and then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. And at this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up. But he fell asleep again and had a second dream. And this time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. And then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. And then Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. So we've had 3 sets of dreams. Joseph's 2, the 2 men in prison, and now Pharaoh. Remember, 2 dreams is going to come to pass. Pharaoh doesn't know what to do, and he gets all of his wise men and his magicians together, and he asks them to interpret the dream, and they can't. And at this moment, the cupbearer, it dawns on him. Oh yeah, when I was in prison, there was a young Hebrew there who was able to interpret my dream. Maybe he can help you. And at this point, it's time. And God raises Joseph from prison to his court. So Joseph has to go in and quickly change his clothes and get dressed up, and we'll put back on the slave clothes. And he puts his outfit on, and he goes up to see Pharaoh. And Pharaoh says, "Can you interpret my dream?" And he says, "It is beyond my power." I'm in verse 16. "It is beyond my power to do this." Joseph replied, "But God can tell you what it means and set you at ease." He's not prideful. He doesn't say, "Yeah, I have this power, I can interpret." No, he attributes everything to God. Everything in his life was attributed to God. I don't know how through the misery and the pain and the suffering and all the feelings he must have gone through, he still has this, but he still attributes all the good things to God. And so when God interprets Pharaoh's dreams and is made the ruler of Egypt, patient endurance leads to the purpose for our suffering. Patient endurance is what you need now so that you will continue to do God's will. Then you will receive all that he has promised, as Hebrews 10:36. We have Jesus, and we need to hold tight in our pain and our suffering and hold tight to what he's doing and what he will do and where he's taking us to be. This is what his interpretation was. "This will happen just as I have described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance of what he is about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterwards there will be 7 years of famine so great that all of the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. And as for having two similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God, and he will soon make them happen. Joseph goes on to say, you need to find a worthy man here in Egypt who can plan this out, organize it, and such a man is needed in this instance. And Pharaoh says down in verse 56, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll just tell you. Pharaoh says, there is nobody who could be more wise than this man who can interpret through God what dreams are. He said, I'm going to make you in charge. You're going to be in charge of all of Egypt. So with the severe famine everywhere, Joseph opened up the storehouses. I did get ahead of myself. I'm very sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. Let's back to where I was. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. And then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. And then he had Joseph ride in his chariot reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, kneel down. So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all Egypt, and Pharaoh said to him, I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or a foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval. Potiphar never needed to worry about his household. The jailer never needed to worry about the jail. And now Pharaoh never had to worry about another thing. And now he placed a royal robe on Joseph. And Joseph is gone now from his coat of many colors to his slave clothes, to his prison garb, and now he has a royal robe. And this is what God had planned from the very beginning, but he couldn't do it at 17. He had to bring him through all of these situations to get him to the point when he was ready for what God had planned for him. He'd be in charge of everything in Egypt. Joseph trusted in God, even through 13 years of slavery, imprisonment, and abandonment. He was hated by his brothers, mourned by his father, always holding on to the promises of God. Even at that point when he gets promoted, they give him the daughter of the high priest, and he has 2 children of his own, Manasseh and Ephraim. So God blesses him there in addition. We read in verses 56 to 57. So with the severe famine everywhere, Joseph opened up the storehouses and distributed grain to the Egyptians. For the famine was severe throughout the land of Egypt, and people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe throughout the world. So what Joseph did and what he said somebody needed to do is during the 7 years of plenty, he took 10% away each year and he stored it up for the 7 years of famine. And so the Egyptians never had an issue with that, and they actually became rich because that famine stretched out into the surrounding lands, and they all had to come to Egypt to buy food. So at the proper time, God will use us as a blessing to others. So let's not get tired of doing what is good at just the right time. We will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. Joseph persevered. He was faithful to God. He withstood temptation. He did not get angry or resentful towards God. God used his abilities and his talents in leadership, his wisdom and his organization to save the known world. But even more than that, he prepared the way for the saving of a chosen people, the children of Israel. Number 5, Joseph's brothers and father come to Egypt. Dun, dun, dun. We read in chapter 42, when Jacob heard that the grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, I love this, why are you standing around looking at one another? I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive. Otherwise, we'll die." Joseph was in charge of all the distribution of the grain. Anyone who needed it needed to come to him. Well, the chickens were coming home to roost. The chickens were coming home to roost. But if you fail to keep your word, then you will have sinned against the Lord, and you will be sure that your sin will find you out. Verse 6, "Since Joseph was governor of all Egypt and in charge of selling grain to all the people, it was to him that his brothers came. And when they arrived, they bowed down before him with their faces to the ground." Sound familiar to the dream that started this whole story? The remarkable message of this narrative is, however, is that Joseph had already forgiven his brothers of the evil. When he saw them, he began to weep. He had to pull aside. He had forgiven them for all that they had done to him. He had to turn away in his sorrow and his distress. Joseph puts his brothers through a little bit. And this is what I need you to read from this chapter through the rest. He first tells them, he says, he puts, "You're spies. I don't believe that you're here for grain. I believe you're spies." They say, "We aren't spies. We're 12 sons of the same father. One is at home and the other is no more." He says, "I don't believe you. Send one of you home and I'll put the rest of you in prison." And he puts them in prison. Overnight he thinks about it more and he goes to them the next day and he says, "I'm a godly man. Leave one of your brothers here in prison and go back and get your other brother. If you bring your other brother," which was Benjamin, his brother from Rachel, "if you come and bring him back here, then I'll believe you're not spies." And when they beg him and they say what it's going to do to their father, this is where he breaks down, because he knows that what he's doing is causing this in his brothers. But he doesn't hate them. He doesn't blame them. What awaited the brothers was not the evil they intended for Joseph, but the good God intended for them through Joseph. What was meant for evil, God meant for good. All of Israel's, or Jacob's, family were saved and grew under God's protection. There's more to the story, much more to it. They leave Simeon in prison and they go back, and the father says, "You're not going to go back and take Benjamin with you." So they wait. They don't come back until all the grain that they had just bought and taken back with them was gone. And then he said, "We have to go get more." And they swear to the father, to Jacob, that they'll take care of Benjamin, and they all come back. Joseph does another thing, putting a silver cup in Benjamin's satchel. And as they're leaving, they get arrested and brought back for stealing it. Again, I'm really going fast through this. You really want to read it. And eventually, Joseph stands before them because he can stand it no longer. And he says, "I am Joseph, your brother." And they don't know what to say. They're speechless. What you meant for evil, God meant for good, for the saving of the world. Joseph became the savior of the world, of the known world of that day. But before he did that, he had to go through really bad times. He had to be a prisoner in jail and help someone with their dreams and be forgotten. He had to be a slave before that and be accused of things he didn't do. He was sinless, and yet he was thrown in jail because of it. His father mourned for him that he had been killed by a wild animal, but he had originally been the favored son of his father. And now the sons eventually take the grain back, and Joseph says, "You are all to come down to Egypt because God meant this for good." It's for the saving of our family. And so I said in the beginning, the 12 sons of Jacob, the 12 sons of Israel, were the 12 tribes of Israel who are in Egypt. And they are given the choice grazing area of Goshen outside of Egypt. And during that time that they're there, and during that Pharaoh that's in charge, they grow in their numbers and grow in their numbers, and they grow in their numbers. And they're so blessed that Pharaoh even gives them his livestock to take care of. And Jacob and his family come down, and they're saved because of what God did through Joseph. God had a bigger plan for Jacob. Jacob was deceived that his son was dead. The sons finally had to face up to it. And eventually when Jacob died, the brothers were all scared that Joseph was now going to kill them. And he said, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. So if you want to turn to chapter 50, that's what it says. Verse 19, but Joseph replied, don't be afraid of me. Am I God, that I can punish you? You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. All of Israel's family were saved. And we know that God causes everything to work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. What would the plan be that God has for your suffering? What is he preparing you for? Can you forgive those who hurt you? The remarkable message is that Joseph forgave them and that he trusted God. So Joseph is a preview of the future, and I don't want you to miss that. The life of Joseph reflects another who will suffer, experience pain and rejection, be loved by his father, be rejected by his brothers, be tempted but not sin, be falsely accused, be condemned with criminals, start his public life at age 30. He'd weep for his brothers, forgive those who persecuted him, and give his life so others can be saved. Patient endurance during suffering produces a man after God's own heart. Produces a man or a woman after God's own heart. Are you a man or woman after God's own heart? That's, if you're after his heart, you believe that what Jesus did for you, then he will cause all things to work together for your good, even the hard times, even the suffering times. Patient endurance during suffering produces a man after God's own heart. How will God be able to use you through your pain and your suffering? Who can you help? Who can you walk alongside? How can you not yell and be angry with God during your suffering times and instead look to him? Okay, God, what is it that you're doing in this? What do you want me to learn through it? What is the ultimate goal that's going to come out of it? Are you going to be saving people to the extent that Joseph did, become the head of the United States, or like he was in charge of Egypt? I don't know. Probably not. But what in your world is God going to use you for? That's what I want you to walk away today and learn from Joseph. He couldn't have known what was happening the next day. Yet God was preparing him all along the way, and he let him know that he was with him constantly because he blessed everything that he did. You can say, well, God's not blessing everything that I'm doing. Well, is he? Maybe you're not looking at it in the right perspective. Maybe you're not looking at it the way God's looking at it. Ask him to show you. Open your eyes to what he's doing in your life, what he's doing in your friend's life who needs you to come alongside them like Reuben did. Even though God changed it around, Reuben was going to save his life. How can you pull along someone and help them? It's not all about you today either. It's what's the pain and suffering to a loved one that you have? What's the pain and suffering to a friend that you have? That's a big part of the story as well, and that's how it applies to us. All of this requires faithfulness, trust, obedience. It requires forgiveness from us and a love for God through Christ Jesus. You know, we talk about Jesus a lot today because we're in the Old Testament, but you know what? All of this points to Him. All of this, everything we talk about in the Old Testament, don't miss it. He's there. He's with God. He is God. He was there at creation. He's through all of this until He comes in bodily form. Do you know Him? Do you trust Him? Are you faithful to Him? Then God promises that make all things work together for you. Let's pray. Father, I just thank you for this wonderful story, this wonderful thing you did in the life of Joseph. Let's not lose the significance of it, Lord. Let's not miss how it applies to our lives. Let us know and understand that you are with us through whatever we are going through. As long as we follow you, we're faithful to you, we do our best to not sin, Lord. We try to resist temptation. We follow your guidance, and we allow you to mold us and create in us what we need to be to fulfill what you have planned for us, Lord, in our lives. Whatever that may be, seemingly insignificant to being the head of Egypt, yet great in your eyes, whatever that is. Lord, if there are people here today who don't have that relationship with you and can't claim that you're going to work all things together for good for them, then I would ask that you would touch their hearts, have them open the door of their hearts to you, Lord, so that you can enter in and that you can make a home there, and that they can know that whatever they're going through, they're not alone, that you won't leave them, that you're there by their side. I ask you to ask Him into your heart today. Anyone who doesn't know Him, and if you do know Him, stay firm. Hang on to Him during the hard times, the suffering times, knowing that He's there for you, He's with you at every moment, and that He will never leave your side. He will never forsake you. Lord, we love you, we praise you, we thank you so much for all you do you did in the lives of Joseph and to saving the people of Israel, because out of that came Jesus. And out of that comes our salvation. We thank you and we praise you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.